and they
So
were
if you
very
went to a
long.
synagogue in the year 1500 in Marrakesh or in Lithuania, you wouldn't hear a sermon, you're saying, on
No,
Shabbat, on a
not on a
regular
regular
Shabbat?
Shabbat.
Wow.
Yeah, you
And
would
you're
not
saying
hear a
it's
sermon
Christian
regular.
influence to have a sermon in the synagogue.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So I want to say something about jihad. I think the West doesn't want to face the reality of what jihad really is. That's what they can't understand. People ask them, what good did it do to destroy the World Trade Center? All you did was kill people. No, that is the idea, to kill people.
Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm here today with Professor Lawrence Schiffman. He is the Global Distinguished Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, Director of Graduate Studies for the MA program at New York University, NYU. He's a specialist in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Judaism and Late Antiquity, the history of Jewish law, and Talmudic literature. And he's given an audio lecture, which I love the title, The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Truth Behind the Mystique in the Hebrew Bible. I found that on your website. Shalom, Professor Schiffman.
Hi, Shalom, how are you?
I'm doing well. I know you were just over in Israel when the war with Iran started, and before the recording, you started to tell me. I said, "Save this for the guests." Tell what happened when you were in Israel and
Well,
and
first
the,
of
and the
all,
missiles started flying.
we were in the synagogue on Shabbat morning
Okay.
when suddenly you had some kind of people, I don't know, milling around and saying things to one another, right? And then, right, before maybe 2 or 3 minutes went beyond that, everybody knew what was going on. Apparently, some officers had been paged, and so they told everybody else what was going on. And at that point, the question was, how long are we going to get on with the service before
Mm.
we have to go to a shelter? But actually, we made it through the whole shelter before the whole service before we had to go to shelters later on. So that was the first beginning of the war. Then, of
Wow.
course, I we have an apartment. I was in our apartment with its own shelter. So I was, of course, in and out of the shelter like everybody else. Actually, that Shabbat I was at my son's, and we were all in his shelter once or twice, and that was no worse than the sad fact that some people really have missiles hitting either where they are or very close. So we just,
Yeah.
so to speak, suffered running in and out of a shelter.
Yeah.
And then I went back to Jerusalem, spent a few days there, but I had a problem because I ended up canceling one day of classes. I teach all my classes on one day. I ended up canceling them after consulting with people at NYU because I really didn't have the right stuff to make it into an internet class. I didn't have any of the materials with me because I expected to be home.
Ah,
So
so your
then,
flight was canceled and you couldn't make it home to New
yeah,
York.
all the flights were canceled because it's
Okay.
dangerous. Then NYU went into action with a company that's a security company that they use that specializes in evacuations. And I
Mm.
and a colleague, his wife and son, were in quotes evacuated, close quotes, by going to Egypt.
Ah.
And we drove to Egypt. We had security guards, which in Israel you don't really need, but in Egypt you do need. But in any case, we drove to Taba, which is the border. We made a perfectly normal, orderly border crossing into Egypt, along with a lot of other people doing the same thing one way or the other. And we crossed into Egypt, and we had a car that picked us up again with security. We drove to Sharm el Sheikh. We spent 7 hours in a very fancy hotel, and I found out the hotel was under $150, and she could say
That's a
sort
lot of
of
money.
privileged. I'm constantly writing us, where are you? Are you moving on? So each stage of the trip. So I joked with her later that you only put us in a $150 hotel. It turns out that it's very cheap to go to Sharm el Sheikh in the most luxurious hotel. And we were there for 7 hours, got a little sleep. 12 midnight, left for our airport to make our 3 o'clock flight. And then because we wanted to get back before Shabbat, they couldn't really get us a very good flight. So
Mm.
we flew from Sharm el Sheikh to Istanbul. Istanbul. We went from there to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to New York. But all those were regular flights.
Mhm.
Normal sitting in the airport, waiting, getting on the plane.
Wow.
Moving on. And that was what happened. And it was really actually turned out to be, for me, to be a great opportunity to see a part of Egypt I hadn't seen. I was in
Hmm.
Egypt. My wife and I were there in 1979
Oh wow.
between Sadat's visit to Jerusalem and the peace treaty. And so it was a chance here to see Sharm el-Sheikh, Sinai on the right, the desert on the right. You get a sense what it's like. And
Uh-huh.
on the left, the shore of the Red Sea, the western shore of the Red Sea. I had only seen that from a boat many years ago when I was on a cruise that went
Mm.
to Aqaba, and when we went to Petra and got to spend one day at Petra on horseback with some Arab driver with a rifle, and it was a lot of fun. So
Wow.
anyhow, the bottom line, right? The evacuation was not bad and provided me some interesting opportunities. And I can only say that we have to be concerned for people who are suffering, but I
Mhm.
would not put myself in that classification.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, and I have a lot of family over there, and they're
Yeah, everyone seems to be, our family's in and out of shelters, but as they say, if you follow directions, you're almost 100% safe.
I
And
saw a
they
video
do.
the other day of this guy. He was alone in his house, and he said, "Look, my wife's not even here. I'm not going to run into the shelter. I mean, nothing's going to happen anyway." And he said, "You know what? If I don't run in the shelter, my wife will be upset with me." He runs into the shelter, and his entire house is obliterated. The shelter's in perfect condition. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is happening. So, I asked my sister and my mother the other day. So are you getting used to this? Is it becoming normalized? And they both said there's nothing normal about this. It's surreal.
Yeah.
So it's
I
it's
think
like
that's
they said.
correct.
One of them said it's like having a baby that wakes you up in the middle of the night, but the baby's trying to kill you.
But I would point out here that the events of this war and what led up to it, starting the Gaza war, etc., this is sort of on the scale of the Six-Day War in terms of major change in the whole power structure. I mean, if you think about it, that Israel is clearly the main military power, and Turkey is staying out wisely. They are a serious military power, but they know that they're certainly not a competitor, and they're not interested in the whole thing. So what happens by the time this is over is that Israel unquestionably is the main military power, and you've got right now Arab nations being protected in different ways by Israel. And forgetting for a moment about the constant discussion about diplomatic relations, the fact is that the relations between Israel and their neighbors and those countries that used to be their enemies are just radically different. And even if they're not the ones that we would best prefer, that these differences are really important. I think the big deal that we have to wait to see is what happens with the government of Iran.
Mm,
And I know that Israel has backed down from claiming that they're there to overthrow Iran, but it would be a great shame if Iran didn't return to being the great country that it used to be. And I'd love
mm.
to visit. That's another thing. And by the
Wow.
way, I live on a street where most of the people living on the street are either people who had their childhood in Iran, or if they
Mm,
didn't have their childhood in Iran, they were born in America shortly after the parents' arrival from Iran. I mean,
mm.
most of the families on my street are Persian Jews. So
Wow.
I'm sort of like in closer contact with what's going on there. It would be a shame if it didn't go back to being the great country.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about Iran is how they could talk the way they could talk, begging the U.S. and Israel to attack them when they have no resources at all. Very
Yeah.
strange. Very
So
strange.
so this is a good segue to the your field of expertise, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what comes to mind here is Milchemet Bnei Or Bnei Choshech, the war of the sons of light and the
Yeah,
sons of darkness, who you had another group of people who perhaps weren't living quite in reality, who thought
right.
they were going to fight an apocalyptic war against a foreign adversary, although those were Jews wanting to fight the Romans. What? So this is really an interesting parallel. What the mind and is the mindset of these people in Iran who these like fanatics? How does that compare to the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? In other words,
Well, okay. So I
how
think
you can't possibly defeat the Romans? What are you thinking?
right. So here's what I would go back for a second and say there are two
Mhm.
different questions to discuss here. One question is the one you've already hit on, which is simply the question: how does a group, and this happened with the Jews in the revolt against Rome, it happened several times. These guys
Mhm.
expected to revolt. They prayed to revolt. They wrote a text to revolt, but they didn't do it. Now,
Hmm.
imagine what happens. We have, first of all, 63 BC, the Romans conquer the place. Then you've got the two revolts of 66 to 73, 132 to 5, which are totally hopeless from the start. Josephus has the speech of Agrippa that says that, totally hopeless. So our friends at Qumran, they share with a lot of other people the hope to overthrow Rome and be independent, even if it's literally messianic, and even in the case of two revolts, if it failed. So that is something they do indeed share with our friends, apparently, in Iran, who thought that they could overpower the great powers.
What
But
do you
there's
mean
the
by it's
second
literally
issue.
messianic? I'm not sure that my audience knows what that's an Israeli term that I think means something different to most of the world.
No, I think something is very important to realize, that now we're back to what I was going to say is the second thing. The
Okay.
second thing is that the type of Islam, this particular Sunni Islam and its Iranian variety, believe in a messianic redemption, which is
Okay.
not the case in most forms of Islam. Now, the
Mm.
Mahdi is supposed to come after great suffering of the people. So
Okay.
you have a kind of ascetic messianism here, which seems to be part of this kind of Islamism.
Mm.
Now, when we go to the Dead Sea sectarians, you have an apocalyptic form of Judaism, but I don't know whether or not the almost suicidal desire to suffer along the way is part of that. There's an assumption when you read the War Scroll and some of the other texts that they're simply going to win a gigantic battle against the enemies of good, who represent the, as you said earlier, the children of darkness, sons of darkness. So I think in each case there is a certain form of apocalypticism that is motivating them. One can sort of jokingly say that the Qumran sectarians were smart enough, apparently, not to start the war that the Iranians started, right?
So this raises a really interesting, and you said messianism, and I want you to define that because I think a lot of my audience will not understand. So in Israel, we'll talk about something being Mishichi and it messianic, but it doesn't mean the same thing in Jewish culture as it does outside of Jewish culture. So what do you mean by that? That there's a messianism.
Well, I think the point is like this, that in a messianic ideologies in Judaism come in two forms,
Okay.
and the restorative and the utopian. This is something the great scholar Gershom Scholem worked out, and Shmayahu Talmon wrote about it also for Dead Sea Scrolls. I wrote about it. The idea is like this, that in restorative messianism, that's a kind of natural thing, that there once was a great empire and you want to restore it. So you work to reattain the greatness of the empire that you had before. And you have a vision of restoring this greatness after having lost it. This is a rational thing because this goes along with trying to make all the improvements, what they call in Kabbalah Tikkun, to try to make the world better and better and to bring about a redemptive state. But then you
Okay.
have the other form. The other form, which is the utopian, is looking to create a society that never existed. That society that never existed is going to be created usually after some kind of violent war. This violent war is going to lead to overturning of the whole world order. Now, it is expected that this type of violent war will lead to the destruction of all evildoers. This is the war of the sons of light against sons of darkness. Discover all the evildoers. And in the end, the group itself is the remaining, so to speak, winners in this apocalyptic process. Now, this is a messianic type, both are messianic. This is a messianic type view, which we would probably use the word apocalyptic, despite the tremendous scholarly debate about what that word really means. I like to use the word the way the dictionary uses it. I think that's sometimes the best thing to do.
Which is what?
Okay.
So what does
Now, the
apocalyptic
point
mean
is
here? You said.
that looking at that, that's a kind of messianism, which they usually mean when they say something is messianic, because it's not realistic. And it's not realistic and expects that something is going to happen to provide some kind of ideal situation that never existed. Like when the Jewish sources say there'll be no disease in some source at the end of days. That would be absolutely phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but we realize that the rational type messianists, like Maimonides, will come and say, no, what are you talking about? Of course there'll be disease, but people will be better people, and they'll try and help the diseased person more, right? The guy will never have to wait to get someone to cross the street for him if he can't walk. But the fact of the matter is that there'll still be natural order. So the utopian type of messianism is what you're talking about in the scroll of the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. And that's the type of messianism which is part of, I say part, of the Iranian type view, because we can never discount the fact that the Iranians have taken over the whole heritage of Islamism and reshaped it in their own Sunni variety. So it's not the same as the Muslim Brotherhood, because they're influenced by Shiism. The two groups are influencing one another, but the fact is that what we call Islamism involves a commitment to a violent overthrow of the reality that we have today, and that's where there's some kind of continuity here.
So I guess maybe I have a little bit of a different question. So I'm young enough where when I was growing up, there was this new movement, which was when Chabad started the chanting, "We want Mashiach now, we don't want to wait." But even Chabad didn't mean we're going to implement. I don't think they meant we're going to implement actively some of the things that we expect to let's say, let's just say it, meaning like in other words, part of the Mashiach coming is that in Judaism is that the third temple was rebuilt. But nobody in Chabad in the 1970s was saying, "Oh, let's go tear down the mosque," because that will require some kind of supernatural intervention.
Right.
And the difference is, so in Judaism, at least as I've experienced it, this messianism is somewhat hypothetical. And then when in Israel, when they'll say Mishichi, messianic, what they mean is somebody who takes it from the hypothetical to the active and says, okay, we're going to go and settle on a hilltop in Judea, because that will bring closer the coming of the Mashiach. And I'm not saying whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Let's leave those politics aside.
Right.
But and so I heard this from Chaviv Retta Gur in a video he did where he was talking about the 12er Shiism was very passive, right? You would fast for the coming of the Mahdi and you would pray for the coming of the Mahdi. And then Khomeini comes in the 70s and says, no, let's make this happen by triggering a world war. So to what extent was the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they wrote the War of the Sons of Light and Sons of Darkness, was this Chabad saying we want Mashiach now, we don't want to wait? Or is this, no, let's trigger this war? Well, that's my question. And do we know?
Here's the problem. The problem is that we still can't figure out the extent to which the War Scroll is a kind of theoretical hope or something realistic. First of all, we need to remind people that in the War Scroll, there is a whole system of scheduled battles, one after another, with the nations around Israel, who are the ancient biblical enemies of the Jewish people. And each one is getting defeated one by one. Now, of course, we know that no war actually would work that way. So there's something idealistic about the way they pose the war. And then there are idealistic legal rulings that the text has regarding fulfilling the laws of war of Deuteronomy and ritual purity and other stuff like that, that does make it seem that it's some kind of theoretical framework. And of course, as everybody knows, they were apparently not collecting arms, or at least none were found at Qumran in the excavations. Somebody took one knife that he found there, made a big deal about it. Well, maybe this is the war. No, that doesn't make any sense. You're not making a war with one knife. So the point is, these are not the people of Masada, even if some of them may have run away there during the destruction of Qumran, but it's not the people of Masada who are actively involved as the Sicarii in a revolt against Rome. So it seems that what you're dealing with here is a theoretical framework, and whether they really thought this framework would come about soon or not, I think they thought that there would be soon a divinely inspired messianic revolution, but there are others who think the opposite. One way or another, the difference, however, is if we come back to the Israeli example, right? I think virtually all, if you want to call them more messianic forms of Israeli Judaism, have certain lines that are created by Jewish law, which prevent certain types of actions, right? And once in a while, they may be violated. And there also may be some very confused people, because some of these groups do indeed have very confused people who do think that they should take actions that Judaism basically doesn't think they should take.
What are
And
some of those laws? Because you're an expert on Jewish
yeah, so
halacha
I'll give you an example of
historically.
what I'm talking about. I was actually I teach a class almost every morning in our synagogue between two morning services. That is to say, people go to one or the other, and depending on where you go, and you can stay after for the class or come early for the class. And it's in the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a work that goes through the entire 613 commandments and laws pertaining to them, etc. Now, we are almost done with this book, having started in 2019.
What?
We used a
Okay.
10-volume edition,
Oh, wow.
and we are now on commandment 604.
Oh, wow.
Now, why
Okay.
do I mention this? Because we right now are on the destruction of Amalek. Now, this is a perfect example that a crazy messiness might think you're supposed to destroy Amalek. Guess what? According to Jewish law, you may not destroy. Yes, you must remember. Yes, you must read a portion in the Torah that reminds you what Amalek did to the Jewish people, but you're not allowed to kill an Amalekite, because we don't know who the Amalekites are, and B, you're not allowed to kill anybody without giving them a right to surrender or run away. Now, the point is that here you see Jewish law coming and taking, obviously, a crazy messianist would think, the end of days, this is great, we're to kill all the bad guys. So who's Amalek? So we can all make our own judgments. I think today many Jews tend to associate a certain group of people, a certain subgroup of that group, as Amalek, right? And you can't just kill them. Now,
So, in other words, this is a
walk
law.
up a person in a Hamas uniform who's just standing there, right? And think, oh, I think he's Amalek, I'll kill him, right? You may not do that. If he shoots at you, sure. Right? But the point I'm making is that Jewish law has cut off the ability to put this almost messianic idea, destruction of all evil, to do it. You can't do it. So, or the conquering the seven nations. You can't decide that the Palestinians are the seven nations, and therefore that you can kill them to get them off the land. Now, we see in the news there are some very, unfortunately, sick individuals who seem to be perpetrating crimes against innocent Palestinians. Right? But of course, we all know that any sensible person thinks that this is horrible and thinks they should be arrested and thrown in jail or whatever else. So the point that I'm making is that Jewish law, in that example, stops you from putting through what someone might think is messianic. Now, when it comes to the temple, according to Jewish law, most people believe you're not even supposed to go on the Temple Mount because of our ritual impurity. So you can't just go up there and destroy the mosque, et cetera, et cetera. This is not to mention minor issues, if you want to call it that, like Jewish legal restrictions on destroying someone else's property. There's a building there. Who are you? So the point is, what happens in all these situations is it gets put off for a real Messiah, where we will really believe this person is divinely sent, and the whole world will turn to worship of God and want this to happen. That's the point.
So what's interesting here is
your point is right. These things are put off in a way that certain actions can't be taken, but other actions, and we'll go back to Chabad for a second, trying to create a world which is a perfect world in which we have brought about the Messianic era, that you should do. That's the difference.
But they do it not by killing people. They do it by saying, we're going to put on tefillin, phylacteries every morning. Right. We're going to keep Shabbat perfectly, right? That's Chabad's strategy, which is a very different strategy.
A not nice joke.
Okay,
there is one group of people where if you're really very, very religious, you kill people. And there's another group of people where if you're really very, very religious, you study Torah all day and you don't work. And that's a very big contrast, because I'll take the second one over the first one anytime. And it's a very important contrast, because sometimes we like to criticize some Jewish brethren who have become very fanatical. But at least the fanaticism almost always is limited to that type of activity, and when it's not, the Jewish community opposes them. For example, those crazy sect that was mistreating children and marrying them
Oh,
off.
Lev Tahor in Guatemala or something like this.
But they're condemned by everybody, right? I remember a very interesting thing when they were in Montreal. The government in Montreal want to take away the children. Who was ready to take in the children? The Belzer Hasidim. Why? Because these are Hasidim. They look at the same clothes, but of course they were completely against the sick behavior of these people. So the point I'm making is that within the Jewish community, when somebody doesn't understand where the proper lines are for this type of activity, the community comes and says, "You've gone overboard. Sorry, you can't do this."
So this is a really important point. It's a bit beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think it's a really important point. So leading up to October 7th, there were all these broadcasts on Al Jazeera. I watched a lot of them, and they were showing Jews, particularly in the context of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or it's actually the Dome of the Rock, because most Jews don't care about the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
You're right.
So that there's a confusion there on their part. They don't know the difference. But in any event, they were saying, well, the Jews want to build their temple. They're going to destroy our mosque, and we have to go defend it, right? They were
They
kind
do
of
that all the time.
They were whipping up the Palestinian population because I think a Qatari likes nothing more than a dead Palestinian, unfortunately. So Al Jazeera is whipping them up into this frenzy, and what they don't understand is, and I want you to comment on this. I think it kind of fits with what you're saying. The prayer for Jews to rebuild the temple is, well, God's going to have to do that. We're not going to tear down any mosque. But in the Muslim mind, and this is interesting, so this is a debate within Islam, is jihad an individual obligation, or is it a ummah, a national obligation? And people like bin Laden were saying it's an individual obligation. If you see a Jew, or ISIS in particular, they literally said this, if they put out things to the Muslims of America, they said, you have these gun shows, go buy the guns and start killing people. What's wrong with you? And a rational Muslim says, wait a minute, yes, maybe there's some obligation to wage war in the name of Allah, but I'm not individually going to do that. Is there any Jew, and of course maybe there's crazy people, right? But most Jews are not looking and saying, oh, we should go personally tear down the mosque. It's the world will decide that when...
There's something also very important to understand.
Yeah.
And this is going to sound a little funny. The government of the state of Israel exercises a certain legal control, which makes very clear to people that certain activities are not going to be permitted. So just as an example, the people who want to bring an animal for Passover onto the Temple Mount and sacrifice will not get onto the Temple Mount with that animal. On the other hand, the government has decided that if a Jew wants to open a prayer book on the Temple Mount, they should be allowed to. They decided this now. They used to forbid it. Now, the point I want to make, though, is that the government and its laws exercise a certain control, which is there besides the inner religious control. So that if a person is going to go overboard in some of these things, the government will say this is not right. Now, these other governments are telling their citizens that they should kill people. So I want to say something about jihad. I think the West doesn't want to face the reality of what jihad really is. That's what they can't understand. People ask them, what good did it do to destroy the World Trade Center? All you did was kill people. No, that is the idea, to kill people. Now, this is something we have a lot of trouble with, right? We don't totally understand why someone thinks that simply killing people is a good thing. And we have to face reality that some of the Islamist groups are at that level of commitment to a type of jihad which may be destructive. Now, in the Jewish messianic idea, the idea is to be constructive. So that also is going to affect, right, the whole scene. But the problem about the jihadist is the jihadist doesn't care if it's destructive. And I think, with ISIS, you see this functioning in the extreme. But I think it's important to understand that, like, I have to say that people don't realize this, that the type of Islamist point of view that has now become what we call Islamism, in reality is encouraging, as you saw on the TV, this type of stuff. And as you said, the rational Muslim knows better because it doesn't accomplish anything, or wants to live according to classical Islam, in which the Jew or the Christian is a protected minority.
So there's a really important point here that I think some of my audience will miss. I'm familiar with the terminology, but they might not be. You use the term Islamism and
Yeah.
then Islam or Islamic, and there's a difference. Would
Yes.
you explain that? Because
Okay, there's this
yeah,
person called a Muslim. Okay, that's a person who believes in Islam. Islam is the correct name for the religion, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, however, Islamic today is used in one and two different ways. I usually avoid using it for that reason, because
okay.
it's sometimes used just to describe what is the adjective Muslim would describe, but sometimes it refers to what we call Islamists. Now, Islamists are people who believe in what we consider to be a fanatical form of Islam, in which jihad is a central idea. And now this is complicated because it comes in different varieties, because the main varieties of it are, I would say, maybe now three. You have, I guess, what we could call the most crazy, ISIS, right, which is almost dead, but not totally dead. It's still operating in the Syrian desert. You know, I was in Syria for 2 days. I have now my passport.
You were in Syria for 2 days?
Yeah, I was in Egypt for 2 days in September, in Syria. It was great, fascinating.
What?
We were guests of the government. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Wait, hold on. You were openly a guest of the government of Syria for 2 days?
Correct.
In 2025?
My wife too, and a group of 12 Jews. Another group went in December, but we were guests out now. And from our point of view, we got to see the Dura Europos paintings up close, the synagogue paintings from the 3rd century. To go back to the question now, so Islamist refers to what we consider to be fanaticism now. ISIS being, I mean, where you have a guy giving his 8-year-old kid a gun to shoot someone in the head right in front of a video, which I never watched one of those videos. I am a strict observer of the Jewish law that you may not get benefit from a dead body. I do not watch videos of people being killed. However, here's what I want to say, that that's the extreme, right? Where violence becomes even just, completely out of sight. Then you've got the problem of the two forms, the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course is Hamas, etc., in which, again, however, violence that's normally prohibited by Islamic law becomes permitted, namely violence against non-military personnel. And you see that with October 7th. But you also see the sickness of it when you get to baking babies and all these raping dead women and guy calling his mother to say he killed 10 people. Good news, this is okay. Then you've got the Shiite Islamism of a country, Iran, that is willing to dedicate the entire country, strangely, to supporting other Islamists who are Sunnis, right? To somehow or another upset the whole world and at least they claim destroy the state of Israel. Now, nobody believes that's real, that they could destroy the state of Israel, but having them build an atomic bomb when they say they want to use it, I don't know. It's worse than North Korea, because North Korea will say they don't intend to use the bomb, right? They're not intending to use it.
North Korea has the bomb for the purpose of remaining in power. Iran openly says they have the bomb for the purpose of destroying Israel. They're trying to get the bomb.
So the point is that these are forms, these three forms, Muslim that are prominent today. Muslim Brotherhood, which in a certain sense, that and Hezbollah is the organization of massive guerrilla war, right? Then you got the ISIS thing, which is almost dead, but the U.S. is pulling out of the Syrian desert. So who knows whether the Syrian government will be able to keep them under control. They're trying. And then you got this Iran thing. Now, the Iran thing, as they called it, was the octopus that fed the others. But ideologically, they're not exactly the same. Even though they're not exactly the same, they all constitute a massive danger to what we call the civilized world. Now, here's the point I want to make. That's what we call Islamism, as opposed to the regular religion, which may see some of these things in its ideal system, but isn't doing them. That's more similar to your example of the Jewish system. where the guy who's pumping gas, who came to the U.S. from Pakistan, or driving the Uber car, is not interested in any of that. He just wants to support his family, and he wants to go to the mosque and worship God and observe the holidays and stuff like that. And so that guy is not in this. So that's what we distinguish between Islam and Islamism. That's the way the terminology works.
So now let's go backwards 2,000 years. We have who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay. I was taught years ago it was the Essenes, but what is your view on that?
The first question that I always have to point out about this is the word wrote. I don't use this word, and I'll tell you why. Because there are several issues. There's the composition and the copying. Now, about 1/3 of the material found in Quran is the Hebrew Bible. So who composed? Anybody from Moses to Ezra, right? So it got nothing to do with the people living there. They just copied and owned these manuscripts. Then we get to the question of who composed, which is what you really want to know, the sectarian scrolls. Because remember, there's Second Temple literature composed by other Jews and either physically brought to the sectarian center at Qumran, or maybe just copied at the sectarian center at Qumran, but they weren't composed by the people there. They were written, in quotes, when they copied them. So good. Now we get to compose the sectarians. So the dominant view is the Essenes. The question that we have to ask is a funny question, is who are the Essenes? We have the descriptions in Josephus and Philo. They tell us certain things about the practices and a few other places, but that's the main thing. But what's very important is Pliny the Elder. Because Pliny the Elder says that there was a sect at a place north of En Gedi of Essenes, and that is why most people think that Qumran was occupied by the Essenes. Now, the problem is, as I say, who are the Essenes? Because the word Essene, we don't know what it means in Hebrew, right? It's never found in Hebrew, except in modern, from the Renaissance on, when Jews started reading Greek texts, but they read about it in Josephus and Philo. But before that, it's never mentioned. It's not in the Talmud. It's not in the New Testament. So the question is, well, is that the correct word for the people we're talking about, who lived at Qumran? Or isn't it? We don't know what the word means. Somebody put an article together. He mentioned 22 possible explanations of the word Essene. Wow. And actually, the guy advocated a strange one, a beekeeper from a cult of Artemis on some island in the Aegean, and he advocated that the sect meant the beekeepers, but there are no bees found at the Qumran caves that we know about. So it was pretty funny. But leaving aside the humorousness of this, we don't know. Now, a funny fact is that the word ECM in modern Hebrew has come to mean the sectarians from Qumran. So I once was giving a lecture to an Israeli audience in a Hebrew program somewhere, and a woman raised her hand. She said, "Ha'im ECM, ECM." Were the Essenes, the Essenes, were the Dead Sea Scrolls the Essenes? Now, so what I want to say about this is there are two possibilities. And this is a kind of a simplistic way of putting it. Either they are the Essenes, and we have to change the way we understand the Essenes in accord with the Qumran materials as the main sources about the group, or they are, the word Essene may refer to a whole variety of groups, of which the group who left us the scrolls may be one of them, that therefore shares certain things with the ones that Josephus and Philo describe, but they're not exactly the same group. But you can't throw out the fact that Pliny says that they were located above En Gedi. Now, a funny fact is that somebody tried to come up with the idea that above En Gedi meant up on the hill above En Gedi. And the late Yosef Aviram, who was working until he was like 104, told me when he was like 102, he went on a tour to see this place that they claimed was really the Essene settlement. And when he got there, he said all the pottery was Byzantine. He didn't know what the heck they were talking about.
So I've done that hike from the entrance to the En Gedi reserve. You go up the mountain, over the mountain, down the mountain, and you come out at, I believe it's Nachal Arugot. Yeah. It's said to be a 7-hour hike. I was in much better shape about 15 years ago, and I did it in 5 hours. But I don't think I wouldn't make it today. So I can't imagine anyone, but there are water sources about maybe like halfway up. That's where the Ain Gedi Water
Yeah.
Company gets their water from.
Yes. Well,
Um,
oh, they make believe they get it from there. Who knows?
or it's from the tap, but they put the label on that it's from
Well,
there.
I
So
understand.
maybe
Someone pointed out to me the genius who started selling water in bottles. I only buy a water bottle if I need ice water somewhere. I can tell you a funny
okay.
story. NYU had a project. We did a lot of research, but regarding together with the Israel Antiquities Authority and Tel Aviv University
Uh-huh.
about Caesarea.
Okay.
So I went with my wife to spend a day, an entire day in Caesarea. I wanted to see every single thing there from the beginning to the end. So they sell water there for a fortune, but it's ice water. And if you're in Caesarea in July and you're there the whole day, it's well worth buying the ice water. So we bought
Yeah.
the ice water for 4 times the price, bottle after bottle after bottle, and it didn't bother me. But normally I would never buy water. It's
That's
crazy.
supply and demand is what they call. So
Yeah, it's there.
so all right. So back to who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah,
What is so Rachel Elior famously says it was the Sadducean Temple Library.
right.
What is your thought on that?
Yeah, so here's a problem about this. I've advocated the fact that the halachic system of the scrolls is based on Sadducean approach.
Okay.
This seems to me to be proven without any question from a whole variety of places, in which case it gives us an opening to understand the exegesis in the temple scroll as an example of how Sadducean exegesis would have worked and let us understand much better the rabbinic references, which are very partial and very unclear, etc. So that part of this, here's the irony. I think that's correct, but she didn't know that I wrote that.
Okay.
She didn't know that anybody ever discussed any of this because she
Mhm.
never read the literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls field. Now, the problem is when you go one step further and you say the Sadducean Temple Library, because the material is anti the temple. Now,
Right.
why
So
would
how
the
could it be the
Sadducean
Temple
Temple
Library?
Library have only works against the temple, saying it's not kosher? It makes no sense. They would have
Let,
works that supported
let's
the temple.
let's
I
maybe back
know.
up and can we back up a little bit and do a little bit of order? Who are the Sadducees?
Okay, good.
Let's
The
assume the audience
Sadducees,
doesn't know anything beyond what they read in the in one of the New Testament books. Who are the
okay,
Sadducees?
right. So Sadducees are in the New Testament. So
Right.
anyhow, by the way, the New Testament is a great source for the history of Judaism. People
Hmm.
don't understand that, right?
Yeah.
Really a great source. Now, there were at this time, according to Josephus, three main Jewish sects. He discusses this starting in about 150 BCE. When he gets to that point in his history, he says, and there were three Jewish sects. The Pharisees are the forerunners of the Talmudic rabbis. That means that they are the forerunners of the Judaism of today, because all forms of Judaism today, with the exception of Karaism, right, and Samaritanism,
Okay.
are based on the Pharisaic rabbinic approach. And it doesn't matter whether it's Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, it's all based on Pharisaic rabbinic approach.
Is that a
Now,
controversial position? Because I've heard people say the modern rabbis have nothing to do with the Pharisees, and the
yeah,
rabbis of the Mishnah didn't consider themselves Pharisees, and I think that's
yeah,
kind of
this is because people want to say something that sounds exciting. But the
okay.
reality of the situation is it's not that they consider themselves Pharisees, they consider the Pharisees to be their forerunners. That's
Right.
not the same thing as considering yourself a Pharisee.
Well, when they
Right?
talk
In other
about the
words,
zugot,
In
the
other words, no. The
pairs,
point of
those are the
look, when we
Pharisees.
go into our university office, we're doing something that started out in monasteries. Monasteries
Mm,
became universities. Does that mean if I say that that I think I'm in a monastery? Of course not. Right. So
okay.
I mean, this is right. The argument that Phariseeism is not the origin of the rabbinic movement is a bit specious. The people say it. The
Okay.
second group that we need to talk about. We've already talked about the Essenes, whether they are the Dead Sea Scroll sect. But we need to talk about the Sadducees. The
Mm,
Sadducees represent the high priestly elite, and we know that they had specific beliefs that differed from those of the Pharisees. We know this from Josephus, and they had specific legal rulings in Jewish law and sacrificial law that differed from the view of the Pharisees, and certainly differed from views later on in rabbinic sources, who in a later period backwards disagree, if we can put it that way, retroactively disagree with the Sadducees.
Okay.
So this group of Sadducees, however, seems to have imparted its view on Jewish law to the Dead Sea sectarians and some other groups as well, because Samaritanism and Karaism ultimately trace back to that kind of approach to Jewish law. To put it another way, there are two main approaches to Jewish law historically: Pharisaic rabbinic on the one hand, and on the other hand, the one which starts with the Sadducees and is, besides being Sadducean, has tremendous influence on Samaritan and Karaite law.
So can you just give an example? That's interesting to me. What sense does the Sadducee approach influence the Samaritan law?
So you have, I'm going to have to remember these examples. I don't remember them too well.
Okay.
There's this guy Boyd who wrote about this, and what happens is that you have this tremendous stringency about menstrual impurity and the actual separation of the menstruant, right? Which it also shares with Karaism. That the menstruant
and the Ethiopian Jews have that as well.
Yes, that's right. Right.
Okay.
And now there is one manuscript of the Mishnah that seems to indicate that there may have been some regular Jews who did this, but the Temple Scroll has it, and it's in Quran, it's in Samaritanism and Karaism. Now we went on a visit to the Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem. You'll like this story. So first of all, the rabbi, whose name was Chafetz Chaim.
That's a very long time ago. Okay.
Yes.
Like you're talking the 80s or 90s. No, 90s would have to be.
Yeah, that any women who are menstrually impure should not go in, because that's the rule of Karaites, something which tried to spread to Rabbinic Judaism, but didn't make it, right? However, not one woman didn't go in, because what rabbinite Jewish woman is going to admit in a public place that she's menstrually impure? So they all went in. Okay. And the point I want to make is he told us that the way in which they operate is that menstruation, because of the separation thing, is not private. So you call your friend up and you say, would you like to go out to pizza tonight? Obviously means with their wives, right? And the guy says, no, my wife can't come because she's nida. She's menstrually impure. Now, in a rabbinite thing, why can't she go have pizza? But these particular approach was to separate the woman. Although they treated the woman luxuriously during this period, he explained that to us also, that the woman would be served everything in bed and taken care of and all, as if she was literally a sick person. Whereas, of course, in rabbinism, you ignore the whole thing. Now, this comes up in New Testament studies, because you have in the New Testament example of this woman who's impure. And many of the commentators mistakenly believe that in the Pharisaic type of world of Jesus, that she would have been separated, but she's not separated at all, because she's part of the community.
So that's really interesting. Are you saying that the Sadducee approach, and I guess we're saying Sadducee in a very broad sense, perhaps?
Yes.
So this broader Sadducean approach influenced, can we say, early Jewish Christians, or I don't know what the terminology here is that
I would say it like this: what it influenced was the exegetes of the New Testament, who didn't understand that in Rabbinic Judaism, the impurity of the woman extends only to going to the temple, having relations with her husband, which is forbidden in that period, and or making a sandwich for someone who's gone to the temple, because it'll be impure. And other than that, there's no restriction. She can, go to work, take her kids to school, go to a social occasion, go out for pizza. I don't know. Could you believe that there was a time before pizza? I actually saw somebody suggesting that, tuna's in the Talmud, tuna fish, right? So somebody said maybe that pizza was invented by Jews.
Well, I mean, they had some early form of pizza, I presumably without tomato sauce. But I was just over in Rome, and I had a bunch of pizza that had no tomato sauce. So anyway, so even today, pizza potentially could be. It's not necessarily New York style. So to what extent did the so you're saying this broader Sadducean approach is embedded in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Right. Now I want to point out something else, which is interesting. I mentioned before that the idea that a menstruant woman shouldn't come to the synagogue sort of tried to make it into Rabbinic Judaism. So
aren't there some rabbinical sources that have that idea? Am I wrong about that?
Well, you have some later discussion in the time of the Gaonim, the early Middle Ages. Now, the reason I mention this This is just a small example of the fact that we have to reckon with cross-fertilization of all Jewish groups all the time, over time. How this happens, why it happens, whatever, right? We have to do that. And there are some funny examples that you can come up with even in modern times. But one example that I like is reciting the Kiddush prayer on Saturday morning in the synagogue when everyone is going to go downstairs to eat it or outside to eat it in another room, right? Which started in Reform synagogues, spread to conservative synagogues, and spread to Orthodox synagogues, as opposed to letting everybody say it himself and make his own blessing when he gets to the place where they're serving what used to be cake and wine and now became more extensive. Here you see it moving, Reform, conservative, Orthodox. And there are other examples like that. And maybe the best example of that is the sermon on Saturday morning. So in modern times, we also see that Jewish groups exchange, even when they claim to disagree greatly with one another, they exchange ideas no matter what you say.
Wait, so tell us about the sermon. Assume my audience doesn't know what the significance of that is.
Well,
is that something that comes from outside Judaism, or what's the
sermon
significance?
is originally a Christian thing that
Okay.
became part of Reform Judaism when it came into being in the 1820s through 40s in Germany, and then began to become a serious movement. And then when the conservative movement came into being, it picked up the sermon, and then the sermon made it into the Orthodox community. There used to be 2 sermons a year in Orthodox synagogues, not during the services, held in the afternoon.
When were the sermons?
So that's where it comes from.
No, when were the 2 sermons a year? I didn't know this.
The 2 sermons of the year were on Shabbat Shuvah, the Sabbath between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and before Passover, the Sabbath before Passover.
Wow.
And
so
those
you're saying if
the rabbi gave 2 sermons. Yeah. And they
so
were
if you went
long.
to a synagogue in the year 1500 in Marrakesh or in Lithuania, you wouldn't hear a sermon, you're saying, on Shabbat?
No, on a regular Shabbat.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you're saying it's Christian influence to have a sermon in the synagogue?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So that's how it came. It's a look, the wedding procession is a Christian thing. The white dress is a Christian thing, right? So the point is that the influences go back and forth.
There was a thing recently that
so I just wanted to make the point.
Go ahead.
You can't talk about the Pharisaic and Sadducean like Jewish legal systems as if they don't have any influence on one another. They do.
Were there things in the Sadducean system? So do you have an example of something in the Sadducean system that influenced rabbinical Judaism other than the whole thing of the menstruant woman? Is there anything
I think it's
like
mostly in the stringencies of menstruation. That's really where it was. I don't think we can document much more than that, but I just gave the one example of women coming to the synagogue. There are some texts in the Middle Ages that tried to make menstrual impurity even stricter, and these things somehow didn't make it, because like there are but there are other examples of this, like preparing food and stuff like that. Revival of some of these purity laws from temple purity. Because remember one thing very important: in the origin of all this, Sadducean type law wants to take temple purity laws in daily life, but Pharisaism does too. They just don't want as much. Sounds funny, right?
Isn't there something about
wants to take over temple purity? So Pharisaism wants to take over temple purity a certain amount, and Sadduceism seems to want to take over much more of it and put it into the regular system of life. And so you get greater stringencies on these issues.
So in other words, there are certain things in the Torah that only apply to sacrificial contexts. And you're saying both the Pharisees and Sadducees wanted to extend those outside the temple.
A perfect example of this is purity, not kosherness, but purity of food. Okay. Now, purity of food, the Pharisaic rabbinic law, in the end, when it completely stopped after the destruction of the temple, got left with one thing: washing the hands before eating bread.
So what's the origin of that? That's a fascinating topic for the audience. What is the origin of what? Because that's not in the Torah, right? Or in the written Torah.
That's not in the Torah. Washing your hands before eating bread is mentioned in Mark 7, right? I joke sometimes if I'm in a dinner with some Christians and I'm about to go and wash my hands before eating the bread, say, excuse me, I have to go fulfill what it says in Mark 7. they may or may not know what I'm talking about, right?
All right. So
So,
what's the origin of that if it doesn't come from the Torah?
so what is like this is that the priests had to wash their hands,
Hmm.
purify the hands before eating the truma, which was the holy offerings that they
Hmm.
got to support them. So they and their
Okay.
families had to be ritually pure in order to share in this food. Now, in order to do this, right? So one of the things
Hmm.
they had to do was wash their hands.
Yeah.
So Jews to this day wash their hands before eating bread. Now, we're not talking about cleanliness, right? Because people wash their hands for cleanliness too, but they wash their hands for ritual purposes, even if they just wash them, 20 minutes of soap and water, like they tell you to make sure you don't get a disease. I'd like to see anybody washing his hands for 20 minutes. I mean, by the time you get finished, you. But okay,
You'll be flaking skin by the time you're finished.
yes, it would be kind of tiring,
Yeah.
also, right? But anyhow, jokes aside, right? They, irrespective of personal cleanliness, which is,
Hmm.
by the way, required in Jewish law, you wash your hands to fulfill this ritual because the priests used to do this in the temple when they ate the truma. So you're doing a temple ritual, but you're doing a temple ritual when you carry a lulav and etrog in a synagogue,
Hmm.
right? On Sukkot, because the main ritual was in the temple, and that's where it was required by the Torah. So there
Hmm.
were quite a number of things in regular rabbinic Judaism that emerges out of the Pharisaic tradition that imitate temple worship. Okay,
Hmm.
but the Sadducees seem to be stricter about this, and this is
Hmm.
what you get. And also, of course, the stricter way of understanding the words of the Torah more literally, which comes out in quite a number of examples. So
Hmm.
the Sadducee, so a lot of people think, Sadducism just died when the temple was destroyed. But it didn't die when you see its legal tradition affecting these various groups. By the way, people who want to get a really interesting experience should see the movie about the Samaritans that accompanied the exhibit in the Museum of the Bible. The
Hmm.
exhibit was arranged by Professor Stephen Fine from Shiva University, but the movie was fascinating about
Hmm.
Samaritans marrying women from the Ukraine because there are too few women. And
Hmm.
but the most interesting thing to me there was they do the Paschal sacrifice. They
Hmm.
actually slaughter the lambs,
Okay.
and there was a woman talking about how the tremendous joy that she experiences when she hears the noise of the animals being slaughtered. And it made me realize that we are so far away from the idea of sacrificial worship that even if we study it in the most open way, we don't totally understand how it works. And she taught, here's a woman speaking Hebrew, right? Wearing, modern clothes, nice, up to date type person,
Hmm.
explaining the tremendous joy at hearing the animals as they're being slaughtered. Very
Hmm.
interesting.
That's really interesting because there's an experiential side of religion, I'll
Yeah,
call
the
it,
way I used to.
that well, not
Yeah,
just that we're not used to. So you're obviously I'm going to make some assumptions here, a religious person, but if I have some colleagues who are scholars who are, just avowed atheists,
yeah.
and I think there's a side of religion that they don't understand. And then they look at, especially they look at Islam and they just have no idea what's going on. They're like,
Well, I
oh,
think there's
well, they're
something
they're
very
gonna
important.
surrender if Gaza's blown up, and you're like,
Yeah,
"No," I'm like, you don't understand how certainly a religious fanatic thinks. You clearly do
yeah,
not
yeah.
understand.
This is correct. I think though it's just a little bit different because no matter how much a Jewish person could be, I'll use this word with a small f, fanatically involved in fulfilling Jewish practices, I think that they still wouldn't understand the Islamism in its really in its conceptual framework. So I think that they understand Muslim religious practice, yes. But the other thing about what you're saying, which is important, is to realize, I think when it comes to something like the sacrificial system, any modern person would not have a very good sense of how to understand it, simply because we don't experience it no matter what.
Well, in Islam, they have, I want to say it's Eid al-Fitr, but someone will correct me in the comments, and they slaughter
Yes.
a lamb or a goat, if I'm not mistaken, and the whole family consumes it, and it's obviously modeled on the Passover sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
Meaning, So they probably understand it maybe better than we do, because
That may be the case.
I've
Yeah.
never participated in an animal sacrifice. So I once went to see the Samaritans do it, but I'm a tourist there, right? It's not the same thing.
Yeah, well, if
So
even if I watched it on TV once, it was in Israel. It was then different night
yeah.
from the Jewish Passover,
Hmm.
but you see in this movie, you get to see much of it,
Hmm.
and it's quite interesting. And as I say, they interview the woman afterwards. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the movie.
So on the one hand, you say the Dead Sea Scrolls reflect Sadducean halakha, that is
Legal tradition, right?
legal tradition, but on the other hand, they're opposed to the temple. The people who wrote they're the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of them, or many of them, are
Yeah.
avowedly opposed to the temple. Right? There's the famous the wicked priest attacked the
Yes.
teacher of righteousness in the day of his Yom Kippur in
Yes. Yes.
Pesach HaBakuk. So how is it that you have this quasi Sadducean belief or ritual that's opposed to the temple, which is dominated by the Sadducees? What am I missing
Okay,
here?
so I personally think now we're not talking about something that everyone agrees to. I have to admit
Okay.
that. I
Right.
personally think that what happened is in 152 BCE,
Mm-hmm.
when Jonathan the Hasmonean gets the approval basically to rule over Judea from the Seleucids. This is the real end of the Hanukkah story, not the lighting of the menorah, because after those events, right, and the conquest by Judah the
Mm-hmm.
Maccabee, we see that the temple was taken back by Hellenistic forces. So Jonathan,
Okay.
only in 152, gets the right to rule, and that's the beginning of the Hasmonean Empire. And my assumption is that because the Sadducees were seen as responsible for everything that went on leading up to the Hellenistic reform and everything that went on there, that he basically threw them out, and priests who agreed with the Pharisees were in control in that point.
From
And
152
therefore, the
BCE.
Qumran sectarians leave the temple. Their Pharisees, at least their priestly leadership, leaves the temple and sets up this sectarian group in opposition to the temple that they no longer approve of because it's following halachic rulings that they think are incorrect.
Wait,
So that's my
I'm having
assumption.
trouble following here. So 152 BCE, Jonathan the Hasmonean, who I think we have coins of his in Paleo Hebrew. So he adopts Pharisaical halakha. Is that what you're saying?
He is not a question of what he adopts. He puts priests in control of the temple
Mm-hmm.
who are going to follow what we later would call the Pharisaic rabbinic or Pharisaic way,
Okay.
rather than the Sadducees, whom he blames for the extreme Hellenism that went on in the temple. Remember, they even had an
Okay.
idol in there. Right? This
Wait.
is
So,
not
but if Sadducees are so strict in their observance of the Torah law, how are they having idols in the temple?
well because they were corrupt. The people who did it obviously were corrupt, extreme Hellenizers. Now, here we got to get into
Okay.
something else very important.
All
It
right.
seems that there are two different kinds of Sadducees.
Ah.
They're
Okay.
pious Sadducees who do
Mm-hmm.
what you're supposed to do according to Sadducean way of understanding the Torah. And
Okay.
these are your middle level priests. And then there are these big shot, highly Hellenistic people who are part of the Sadducean group. And the one group is constantly in Josephus's stories leading people down the wrong path. And the other group is the
Okay.
real pious people who, when whoever takes over in the aftermath of the Hasmonean Empire coming into existence with Jonathan 152, our group opposes them. And that you can see from the so-called MMT text, in which they write a letter to the mainstream guys running it and say, if you'll do X, Y, and Z, we'll come back. But you know we're right, right? And we are
Mm-hmm.
following the true way. So
Can you talk a little
apparently,
bit about 4QMMT? That's a really important. Miktsat Maaseh Torah.
yes,
Talk,
very
talk about
important.
that's a really important text.
Yes, because in which presumably the sectarians are writing to the leadership in Jerusalem and to these priests that are now
Mm-hmm.
running it and saying you're doing it all wrong. And this becomes a matter of law, sacrificial law, and purity law. That it's all being done not according to the way the sectarians think. Why? Because they're following a Pharisaic approach.
So
That's my assumption.
4QMMT is clearly aligns with Sadducean halacha
Yeah.
as it's brought down in the Talmud in particular,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Okay. And so there you have a text where um there and so this is why I think maybe you're saying there's two Sadducean
Yeah.
varieties.
two
There's
kinds of
one
people
that's
called
very much
Sadducees.
cares about the Torah, and there's another one that's like, an idol. It'll
Look,
make our
I want to
masters
give an example of the same
happy and
phenomenon,
yeah.
right?
Okay.
You know that the term Reformed Jew is
Okay.
used for two kind of people. One kind of
Okay.
person that goes paying dues to Reform synagogue, going there on Sabbath and holidays, and sending his kid to a Hebrew school. How
Yeah.
many times you hear somebody call a Reformed Jew who actually has nothing to do with the Jewish community, right? So the
Okay.
term is being used in two very different ways, right? So now the what's going on here, that's how the term Sadducees, because it's a little different, because this upper crust of highly Hellenized people are part of the Sadducean high priestly inner social, economic, etc. group, which is the ruling class. And by the way, this is the ruling class that was supposed to control the country and keep it from rebellion against Rome. And of course, from the Roman point of view, this ruling class failed.
So I'm going to bring a different reform analogy. So I once encountered I was visiting in Ohio, and I was at a conservative synagogue, and they were telling me about the Reform synagogue down the road, where there was a young boy wanted to do his bar mitzvah, and they wouldn't allow him to wear a talit or a kippah at his bar mitzvah reading of the Torah.
Yeah.
And now compare that to the Reform synagogue in Baca in Jerusalem, near where I live, when I lived in Israel. That's a completely different type of reform, right? Meaning they're deeply immersed in Jewish ritual, traditional Jewish ritual, and but they both go by the label reform. And then comment on this. So imagine if I'm somebody from, I don't know, China, and I'm trying to explain what Protestants in America are. And I say, David Koresh was a Protestant, which is true. But he wasn't. But he was nothing like the Protestants at the Methodist Church or something.
To get the sick example, let's just take the position on matters pertaining to Israel of most of the evangelicals and most of the mainline Protestants, and they're all Christians. So that is a better example than talking about someone crazy. Talking about regular, normal Americans and who take very, very different positions on something which is important in current affairs and from a religious point of view. So, why not?
Okay. So in other words, you could say what do Protestants believe about Israel? You ask Tucker Carlson and you ask Ted Cruz, and you get completely different answers.
Well, you do, but Ted Cruz is the majority.
Okay. Well, no, Ted Cruz represents more evangelical Christianity,
it's the majority of evangelical Christians don't agree with Tucker Carlson.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that he's.
I think that's very clear.
Okay. So, all right. So there's different varieties.
He's making a career. He's making, you know how much money he's making by this stuff? That's the problem. In America, if you say outlandish things, you can make a lot of money.
Okay. Well, so let's go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We should try it
right now. We've got much money.
Let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're reflecting Sadducean halakha or religious practice and ritual, and but they're opposed to the temple.
Yeah, so they actually say you're not allowed to go there.
So
it's impure.
So I've got a lot of Christians who watch this, and they'll say, "Wait a minute, the temple was controlled by the Sadducees because the high priest Ananias was a Sadducee in the Book of Acts or something."
Yeah, but see, that's what I'm arguing.
So how do we get 100 from 152 BCE, where the temple's controlled by Pharisees or Pharisee halakha, proto-Pharisee, whatever you want to call it? Now fast forward to the New Testament. What happens 180 years later?
Well, because here's what's going on. If you follow the Maccabean period, you'll see the gradual reemergence into the aristocracy and the leadership of Sadducees. In fact, when you get to John Hyrcanus and Alexander Judaeus, they are cultivating them to get into their leadership group in order to have more power within the society and to have a more consolidated rule. Once the Romans come in, they start, since 63 BCE, with the end of the Hasmonean Empire, they start to appoint the priests. And by this time, right, the Hasmoneans have deteriorated, for all intents and purposes, into Hellenized pseudo-Sadducees anyhow. And so they appoint priests who basically are Sadducees, and the priests are controlling the temple from some time in the end of the Hasmonean period, right? Basically running up through the Roman period, no question.
So, for example, Alexander Jannaeus persecuted the Pharisees, didn't he? As
Right.
King Josephus.
Right.
With the etrog pelting and all that.
Right.
So,
By that time you see it.
Yeah. Okay. So in other words, the Pharisees are controlling the temple in 152 BC in your model, which, like you said, maybe not everybody agrees with.
Or certainly priests. When I say the Pharisees, I'm talking about priests who agree with the Pharisee position.
Okay, Pharisee halakha, okay, approach. And then can you talk for the audience a little bit about the Tractate of Horayot, where they're instructing the high priest on how to perform the ritual, because there's an assumption that he's a Sadducee. So how does that tie into this?
Yeah, no, actually the main point, the main part of that comes in the Tractate Yoma, that starts out right in the beginning by explaining how the high priest is prepared. Now, the question is whether this is exactly what happens or not. This tractate assumes that the position of, let's call them the Pharisaic proto-rabbis, is going to be practiced in the temple.
Okay.
And that what they do is they go to the high priest before the Day of Atonement, and they make him promise that he's going to follow their ruling. Now, what are we talking about here?
I mean, he actually swears.
That's what we're talking about. When do you light the incense? Before going into the Holy of Holies. The high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. Everybody agrees with this. Once a year.
Okay.
Now, when he goes into the Holy of Holies, he's going to go in and perform an incense ritual in there. There are two possibilities. The Sadducee position was light it outside. When you come in, you don't want to see the divine. So you got to have it burning already. The Pharisees say, what are you, crazy? There's no divine. It's an empty room. That's the whole point of our religion. There is nothing to see, right? Yeah, there's an ark in there and there's cherubs. There's no God. He's not in there anymore. I mean, he is, but he's everywhere, right? His presence is there, but nothing to see. So therefore, you got it wrong. You don't light it before you go in. You do exactly like the Torah says. You go in and then you transfer the incense onto the coals in this shovel he carries, and at that point, the incense comes up. Now, this may sound unimportant to some outsider somehow, but it has to do with how you interpret the Torah. So anyhow, right, so what the Pharisees would do every year is they go to the high priest, and according to this account, and make him swear that he wouldn't do according to the Sadducean way, that he would not put the incense onto the coals until he got inside the Holy of Holies. And then it says, right, that he would go away and cry, and they would go away and cry.
Wow.
Why would they all cry? They cried because they had to make him swear, and he cried because they suspected him of being a Sadducee. Now,
so you have this dichotomy. There's a Sadducean presumed high priest,
right?
But then the people who call the shots and tell him what to do are Pharisees.
That's the assumption of this account. Now, that may have been it sometimes, right? And it also may have been, see, we can't know this. In the later Second Temple period, there may have been a consensus of what they may have said, okay, you know what, we'll do it your way. But you see,
look, that very much fits with what we read in the book of Acts, that you have this council, we'll call it Sanhedrin,
right?
That has people who are Sadducees and some are Pharisees, and they're debating about Paul, and he realizes he can turn one group against the other. Meaning it kind of rings true. Yeah,
there's one thing we got to remember about the book of Acts and these other things. We got to remember that the Jews are not ruling the country. The country is ruled by Rome. The capital is Caesarea, not Jerusalem. And the Roman governor and his officials run the country. Because this is what people don't understand, both about the New Testament and much of the Mishnah. They don't. They think that this is the government. It's not the government.
Okay.
Right? It's some inner self-government within a big empire.
So there's this big thing going on now in social media about the Talmud, and that the Talmud has all these horrible things about the Virgin Mary and Jesus, and about Goyim means animals, and Jews are required to kill them. Can you talk about this?
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.